My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Charles Malet, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Not at all. It's, as always, a pleasure, even if it's not been so long since we were last doing this together. But no, it's always good to talk. There is always something to talk about, Jerm. I think that's the thing, isn't it?
But these intros always feel so artificial because you have to do it because somebody listening for the first time kind of has to get the intro. But, you know, you and I know each other and we were talking before I hit the record button. So it's always so scripted.
Yeah, but I think it's good. I think it's fantastic that we can think that this could end up anywhere. And especially, although one might be skeptical because of the control that they assert over what it is that we do and what we put out. In fact, the bonus, I would say, of the algorithm or algorithms, and I'm already slightly out of my depth because I don't necessarily especially understand how this stuff does work, but when you think of the way in which people do consume content when they're away from a website, so clearly this is a UK column broadcast, but could end up anywhere, and therefore what we discuss today will have an effect on that algorithm, and therefore people will see it. And I do find that fascinating. So I think it is worth introducing ourselves and talking about what we do, because I think there is an element of confusion. And I like to think that we are occupying a unique space as far as UK Column's concerned, as ostensibly as a news organisation, but your podcast again is I think unparalleled. The simple fact that it comes out every day, every weekday, and that you cover such an incredible breadth of subjects and speakers is phenomenal. That's worth talking about.
I often use the metaphor, trenches, information, or the battlefield, information war.
Yeah.
So I guess a pertinent question for you, Charles, is how is the information war treating you?
I think pretty well. I think one learns over time how to regard it and the fronts and the players and the supposed threats, risks, all that kind of thing, if one's to overlay military terminology. I think the way I look at it is not just to consider, as I do, of course, but not just to consider the battle that we face in terms of getting hold of information that we can regard as being correct, but also to think about how we are censored in what we do and how information is regarded. But actually, I always think about the entire picture as being something from which you can continually glean intelligence. You can tell by the reaction to or the response to something, you have an idea, you have a better idea than about that person, about that organization, and that's very telling. So I think that the way in which we operate is to, we're here to produce content. We're putting content out. Now, there's always a response to that. There's a response to what we do. And I would say looking at what you describe as the intelligence preparation of the battlefield, looking at what it is that you're reading into everything, I think it's fascinating. I think one thing that's come out recently, or at least perhaps come to a bit of a head recently, which is an interesting one for UK Column, is a view that the discussion around a topic is confused with an endorsement of it. And I think your podcast is particularly susceptible to that. And I do find that very interesting because that tends to be seized upon by people who are supposedly sort of examining and investigating the various corruptions and tyrannies going on in the world. And you'd think that in the main, that would lead people to want to devote their efforts to working out how to deal with those things. But interestingly, that's not always the consequence. And often the consequence can be to turn inwards and to start criticizing others around you, particularly, I think, in a a misconstrued sense, we talk about a huge number of different topics on UK Column. Mike and I and you on our banter sessions discuss all manner of things. And I think unless we are absolutely damning everybody to hell, then it's assumed that we're in support of whatever it is we're discussing, which is a totally ludicrous assumption, and I would say a very lazy assumption as well. But I do find it fascinating, and that will. This might sound like an ugly segue, but we are going to talk a lot about Africa, my experiences in Africa, having worked in various guises there, and what I'm going to describe over the course of this hour is not my endorsement of what is going on. They're going to be my experiences and my views, my sort of analytical comment, but that is not necessary to be considered an endorsement. If it is an endorsement, I guess I would say so. I think that is going back to your original question about this being an information war. Yes, it is, and I think it's regrettable that the picture one has from a particular position is constantly confused and frustrated by a lot of those that are around you. But then again, that is not entirely dissimilar from war. When confusion reigns, it doesn't matter how sophisticated your communications equipment is or your plan is. In actual fact, the reason that the fog of war is so described is because things do become incredibly confusing very, very quickly, and even to the point of not being entirely sure who is shooting at whom. I mean, it is a very, very odd environment. So I think the parallel that you draw to refer to the information war as and use sort of jargon associated with conflict and warfare, I think it's bang on, because I think it does absolutely, and the idea of people sort of switching sides or carrying out subversive activities, all those sorts of things, it's a really great overlay, I think.
Well, I mean, you created my segue because Africa is full of war, and why actually I want to chat to you is just to get some of your experiences in Africa, in the real thing.
Yeah. Well, people will bridle at hearing yet another white man talking about his experiences in Africa.
Well, not only white, but also British.
Well, yeah, thanks. Yeah, exactly. So just to get that out of the way, I mean, I suppose that here comes the endorsement. I have been lucky enough to spend long periods of time in largely sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit in the north, but really only sort of holiday making, but mostly in a work capacity or sort of extended travel capacity, sub-Saharan Africa. And the endorsement is that the reason I've done that is because I was lucky enough to travel to Africa when I was, actually initially briefly as a teenager, and then I went back and worked and traveled through sub-Saharan Africa after leaving school, and found it to be a place that absolutely captured my imagination. And therefore, fast forward to, I suppose, what was it, getting on for 20 years ago, as an officer, as an infantry officer in the British Army, and I was reviewing my options job-wise, and I saw that there were a few posts sort of commensurate with my rank and position and whatnot in Africa, and I thought, wow, that really would be an amazing opportunity. That would be very different. I'll go on to talk about that. I think that'll be sort of the main thrust. But also for context, I have worked on the sort of corporate side of it as well, which again will conjure perhaps an image of being behind a desk, wearing a suit. Not at all. I'm talking about being in the bush, managing mining exploration operations in very, very remote areas. So I do have, by sort of dint of circumstance, quite a broad spectrum of different experiences, sometimes all in the same countries. And therefore, it's not. I'm not trying to set out my stall as though, that means I'm really well qualified and my opinion matters and should be taken as read. I absolutely don't mean that at all. I can only talk about the things that I've seen and the opinions I've formed based on that. So I'm not at all prefixing this by saying, I'm an expert. But what I would say, though, is that my experiences from decades ago, or at least from decades ago up to now, are a very interesting perspective to have when one reviews what's going on in the world, particularly through a British prism or British lens now, and how you can point back and think, right, okay, now I see how those things connect. So just to have an insight into how some of these things do work, for me, has been completely fascinating. And as I say, I have always been drawn back to Africa. There is nowhere like it, and I can qualify that by saying that, with the exception of the Antipodes, I have travelled to all regions of the earth. And no, I mean, okay, everywhere's unique. Of course it is. What a daft thing to suggest otherwise. But there is something about Africa which just, you cannot sort of bottle and export anywhere else. Just wouldn't work. It's very, very particular. And that does play into the to the working context. Working with Africans is phenomenal. And I think the types of experience that you come away with, you don't get anywhere else. So in terms of endorsements, if we get the endorsements out, I am very pro Africa. I think it's terrifically regrettable that so much of Africa has, for so many years, not fulfilled its potential. And also, because I know the last time we spoke about this on a banter session, I think there were a few comments suggesting that we let Africans off the hook. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to damn Africans, by which I suppose I mean people who, this is a difficult one with you as a white South African. I'm not.
I am African.
Yeah, no, exactly. You are, and so this is it. So I don't want to get drawn necessarily on that, but I know what people mean. I mean, essentially,
yes,
we
are
mean
black African.
Yeah, exactly. We mean black Africans, and black Africans, like white Africans, like white people, like people all over the world, they have their fair share of corrupt, sort of cabals of greedy people, and they don't do anyone any good. I mean, that is absolutely the case, and I can go on to talk about that as well. So that's my sort of African background, but it's the defense bit, the military bit, that has been, the moment that is kind of coming back into relevance, because I think for long periods of time, no one's really seen the point in considering Africa until now. I think there are many reasons now why looking at Africa does make a bit more sense in a military context.
Quickly to jump in, I always found it fascinating when we talk about Africa. You were quick to say sub-Saharan, and it's a good point, because when you say Africa, you don't really think of Algeria or Morocco or any of those sort of North African countries. No, but I mean, I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I'm saying it's just an interesting psychology how the world views Africa.
Yes, I agree, and I think that's there are lots of reasons. That's sort of the Bob Geldof effect. And actually, for anyone who hasn't been to Ethiopia, the other Bob Geldof effect is that white people are treated like they're sort of cash points. And you will see, wherever you go in Ethiopia, you have children running up to you, running after you, saying, "Give me pen, give me birr." Birr is the Ethiopian currency, and they just want pens and money because that's what they're used to seeing white people come and do. So, yes, I'm not trying to dismiss the idea that sort of, humanitarian support and whatnot, but anyway, that is another rabbit hole. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think unless I think if you're part of the Francophone world, you probably do, when people talk about Africa, I think you probably do consider North Africa and of course West Africa far more when people say Africa. But yes, I think if your world is sort of British centric, then yes, Africa does conjure the idea of black people in sub-Saharan African countries. I think
it's not just British. I'll give you a quick anecdote, very funny. When I went to Sydney, on the flight, I flew Qantas, and on the flight I had to fill in a little form, it's for customs and immigration, etc. And one of the questions was, have you been to Africa? And I had just left Johannesburg. So I was on my way to Sydney, direct flight from Johannesburg. So I didn't answer that because it's silly. And I wanted to see what the response would be on the other side. And when I went through customs and immigration in Sydney, she says to me, "Sir, you didn't complete the form." I said, "Oh, which part did I leave out?" She says, "Well, it says, yeah, have you been to Africa?" So I said, "Do you know what flight I was on?" And she said, "Yes, you've just come from South Africa." And I said, "Okay, so what happens now?" And she says, "Well, we actually mean Africa, Africa."
Really? Okay. Wow.
So I've never forgotten that.
That is amazing. But I have to say, I do remember I first sort of travelled properly in South Africa in 1996, and I very well remember. And at that point, that was the only African country I'd been to, and I can remember crossing the border on the train up into Zimbabwe. And this is not. I'm not saying this in order to criticise South Africa, but at that time, I'm not saying there wasn't such a thing.
You can criticise.
Well, no. All I'm going to make the point is that as a white person traveling around South Africa on public transport in the mid-90s was interesting. There was a tension there. There could be at times, not always, but certainly in some of the urban areas, there could feel like a little bit of a tension. And as an example, I remember very clearly being in a bus ticket office it was either in Durban or Port Elizabeth, I can't remember, but somewhere on that coastal route, and sitting at the desk, it was a white guy behind the desk selling tickets and buying a bus ticket on to wherever, I can't remember where it was. And I was with a friend, behind us, somebody walked in, and the guy opposite said, "Oh, here's trouble." And he pulled open the drawer of his desk, and there was a pistol in the desk, and he put his hand on the pistol and waited to see what this young black guy was going to do in the event. Luckily, he either did nothing or walked out or sat down and joined the queue. I can't remember what it was, but there was enough in that moment for that chap to perceive that there was a potential threat. Now that is not something I've seen anywhere else in any other part of Africa. So just to contextualize,
South Africa is weirdly more aggressive. There's a lot more tension here than there is elsewhere on the continent. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I just think that's just to go back to your Australian lady questioning you, there was a marked difference at that time. I mean, it persists, I think. But crossing the border into Zimbabwe, just the way that the conductor dealt with people on the train, because you cross the border and obviously you do the whole passport and immigration thing on the train and all that. It was very different, and that was quite striking. Which is not to say that there isn't, violence and plenty of sort of unrest in other places. There absolutely is, but I think the way it manifests is different from how it is in South Africa. And I think as a non-native white person, the feeling that you have around you is different in South Africa than it is in other places. That's something I did find interesting.
But your your actual African time wasn't really South Africa; it was more in the north.
Yeah.
So where
exactly.
did you go first?
Well, in a work capacity, and this again was an interesting one. I think it tells a lot about the psychology of people in general, but actually the way people talk about stuff. And I think I can overlay this onto the sort of, well, what can we do? You know, we see the government's tyranny, we see this, that, and the other. What can we do? I mentioned earlier that when I was a sort of junior-ish officer in the army, I had the opportunity. You get to a point in your career where you get to look at a list of jobs rather than just being told where you're going to go next. And there's a long list of jobs. And as I say, I saw a couple of African ones. One was in Nigeria and one was in Kenya. And I'd not been to Nigeria before, but I had been to Kenya. So instinctively, I thought, well, I should go to. I should put in for the job in Nigeria because I think it'd be more interesting. However, for reasons that I can't quite remember, actually the Nigeria job seemed like a bit of a dead end, or actually had the possibility that it was going to be canned. So it didn't seem terribly sensible. So I applied for this job in Nairobi, and I was accepted. I got the job, and then I told. I obviously told those that I was serving with in my regiment, those that were around me, that was the job I'd got. And the reaction universally was, wow, that sounds absolutely fantastic. I wish I'd got a similar job or got that job or whatever it was. I just thought, wow, that is really curious, because we're all in the same boat. We all get to look at the same list. And you didn't choose that. You didn't go for it. So you're saying, I wish I was doing that. And it sounds like an option that I would have gone for. And yet I haven't. Now, there are all number of reasons why people may have said that and not thought it. But I just thought it was an interesting one, because we're always talking now about these sort of, well, what can I do? And then you say, well, you could do this, that, and the other. And the response is either silence or, well, no, I'm probably just not going to do that. So that was quite telling. But this was to fulfill what was described as a defence diplomacy role. Now, the various European nations at the end of the colonial period, when independence came about, each country had a different way of handing over a different type of control that they were going to exert on that particular country afterwards. And in most of the colonies that had been British, from a military point of view, there was at least a toehold retained. And the way that had happened in East Africa, using Kenya as the kind of powerhouse, because that had been sort of economically the strongest of those countries, what they did was they retained a sort of training and mentoring team, and that was run through the staff college, and therefore that evolved over time. And the way that it worked is that technically we were on loan to the government of Kenya. So this is straight into what's regarded as neo-colonialism, as though it's white Brits going out to tell the Africans how to do it. Now, it's not quite that simple, because we wouldn't have been there if the government of Kenya hadn't specifically wanted us to be there. So it absolutely is a back-scratching exercise. It's definitely not a one-way street with British just going out there and saying, right, this is how you do it. We're the ones that benefit. And I did talk about this on a banter session the other day, because in actual fact, there is considerable guile, and I think the way in which the government of, well, actually you could say any African nation, but I mean the way in which the government of Kenya and the armed forces ran their side of the arrangement meant that very much they got out of it what they wanted. And so, but just as an example, I mean, my role primarily was to provide a sort of liaison in a headquarters that the British taxpayer had built right beside the airport in Nairobi. Now, I'm out of touch. I don't know what that building exactly is used for now. But the point is that despite the fact we had paid for it and we were providing quite a lot of funding for various activities and indeed a member of staff, it was not at all to be used exclusively for that purpose. So there was quite a lot of other stuff going on, which again just suggests that, you know, these Africans are not daft. They are not ill-equipped when it comes to considering how to achieve the best outcome for themselves. But nonetheless, it was a very interesting engagement. And the reason that I'm just laying a bit of groundwork here is that here we are nearly 20 years later, and only now, literally within the last month, has the British government written something that it calls its defence diplomacy strategy. So this is something that's been going on since the waning, or since the empire as it was sort of shut up shop. Of course, it didn't, but you know what I mean. Since independence came, what is described as defence diplomacy now has been going on in every single country that we had set foot in, and yet only now are they describing it as a coherent strategy. Now, I find that pretty interesting, and I think there's a lot going on here which is absolutely not being stated overtly, but the trend in the last 4 years in particular, of course, for the British has been absolutely overwhelming and completely unqualified support for Ukraine. Now, Ukraine was not on the British radar from, well, I mean, okay, it was a little, but not really going back much more than about 10 years. Operation Orbital to train up Ukrainians, but essentially Ukraine had just been considered to be something of a backwater, largely irrelevant. And yet there's been absolutely terrific swing towards Ukraine, and this is very much part of what's described as the defence diplomacy strategy. Now, how does that relate to Africa? Well, I think it is rather interesting, and I think that we're seeing this with what's happening in Iran, and in particular, for those that do listen to Carl Zar's Silk and Steel podcast, I think this is exactly what Warwick Powell has been talking about over the last few weeks, and this is the consideration by nations that have historically had very strong links and ties to the United States, basically reevaluating their options. And so the United Kingdom, European nations, as part of NATO, have obviously had very, very strong allegiances, very strong ties to America. A lot of that now is looking, I would say, quite regrettable. However, because America is still a military superpower and critically the producer of so much kit that everybody else needs, those nations are in a very difficult place with regard to how to extract. And as an example of that, the United Kingdom, which of course is a nuclear power, is totally dependent upon the United States to be able to actually exert any of that power or influence. It doesn't control its own nuclear capability, not exclusively. That's a bit complicated. So the point I'm trying to make is that the idea that that the status quo, or at least the status quo that we were told about, which was that the United States and the United Kingdom are sort of joined at the hip and will always be acting in concord and this, that, and the other, it's total nonsense. So you look at what's happened with Iran, and you look at the way in which the United States was basically directed by Israel, and the way in which the United Kingdom has done absolutely nothing but in effect toe the line whilst pretending not to be. What choice do they have? How on earth are they able to say no? Because if they do, they are done for. But this is why it comes back to Ukraine. So the focus has been concentrated on Ukraine, but in a way that is all about European security. It's not talking about NATO, they're talking about European security. And I think that is absolutely fascinating, and I think that it does bear direct relation to the goings on or the lack of goings on in other parts of the world over the years, Africa in particular.
Did you notice the same thing, though? Because you've been to various countries. In other words, did you find the same overlapping, is narrative the right word? Perception, maybe?
In other African countries?
Yes.
Yeah, it's different because, of course, the other detail, what I'm describing is sort of my experiences through the lens of somebody who was involved, in what was basically a British government project. The way to think about it really is, well, what does it look like if you are African, if you're either part of an African nation's armed forces, or if you're part of an African government, or part of the African Union, because they're all in some ways in conflict with one another. And this is where the whole picture became so very complicated, because there are such terrific rivalries between the African countries. They may, let's face it, they may only be superficial to a certain extent, but it did mean that that relations between countries were often direct. So you'd have, the British would have a direct relationship with the government of Rwanda, direct relationship with the government of Kenya and Uganda and so on, rather than imagining that they are a sort of cohesive bloc. And the reason I make that distinction is because, as far as the African Union is concerned, they are a cohesive bloc. That is the idea that they're putting forward, that they can split the continent into 5 regions, and that each one will somehow provide a capability for the African Union, even if the support, the funding, the training, the mentoring, everything else is an absolute patchwork of cooperations and partnerships with mostly other European or sort of Western nations. So the whole picture is very, very complicated. And
but also, sorry, if you don't mind me jumping, but it also helps create a little bit more understanding into why there is this general antagonism from Africans to foreigners. It's not the case across the board, but I'm talking in terms of a macro level. They'll talk about let's get them out of Africa. Like here in South Africa, all our mines are not controlled by South Africans, and that trend is the same through most of Africa. And then you can kind of see where there's a correlation between that and excessive poverty, and then you realize, okay, it might actually be understandable why there is this kind of inherent animosity. There shouldn't be, but it seems to be imposed.
I think so, but you see, again, I think that's sort of deflection, because I would say deflection. That's creating a scapegoat when, in actual fact, that's probably not quite the case. So the link, like you say, between, say, control of all of the mining infrastructure and poverty in the country might not necessarily be one that we can really make, because does the one prevent the government of that country? No, not
necessarily.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you know, also, like, you got, I think, 14 African countries that still use the French currency.
Yes. Yeah. Oh no. I mean, I'm not dismissing it. All I'm saying is that I think it's not one totally joined up thread. I don't think that it's reasonable to say that you can blame Western countries, Western companies for everything that befalls.
No, that's fair.
Africans. And I think that's quite a critical part of it. And that goes back to what I'm just referring to, because the degree to which Africans were actually not willing to cooperate with each other was quite staggering. And that could be, on a sort of just an armed forces level or a governmental or diplomatic level. That was, you could say the picture is slightly confused by there being any other influences, if there are any other Western sort of involvements in any of that. But even when there weren't, that picture is confused enough. So I think to lay all of that at the door of the West, I think, is unfair. And this is what I said at the beginning of Africans are not blameless. I mean, there are some very, very good books on exactly
lots
like
of
you
tribalism.
describe. Yeah, absolutely. Lots. I mean, one fascinating book I would say about Eastern Africa. I mean, it is specifically about Kenya. It's by Michaela Wrong, and it's called Our Turn to Eat, or it's either It's Our Turn to Eat or just Our Turn to Eat. And it's again the post-colonial state, well, actually, and indeed the colonial state of countries with regard to what we describe as tribal makeup. It can be different. I mean, think of Tanganyika or Tanzania and the way that was all effectively changed at point of independence. But certainly in Kenya, tribal identity and politics completely overlap. And her book is about, I mean, the specifics don't really matter, but it's about the Kikuyu, the sort of largest, central, most powerful tribe, the Kikuyu tribe, being in power. So when you get a Kikuyu president, they regard it as being their turn to eat. So effectively, that's your hand just goes straight into the till, and that is really all it's about. It's about just sorting out your own people absolutely to the detriment of others. So I think there are many, many elements of this, and the West, what does the West do? I suppose to a certain extent capitalizes on it, because of course it means that if you know that those people that you're going to be dealing with are corrupt in some sense, then you're going to use that corruption to your advantage. And I think that's what we see playing out. So, I'm not trying to absolve either party, as it were, from blame, but I think it has to be acknowledged that that there are, I mean, okay, it'd be very difficult, but there are ways in which African countries could be solving some of these problems. And as I say, there's some very good literature on essentially putting forward the point that the best thing for Africa would be to just do their own thing and to get rid of exactly the class that you're talking about, the controlling corporate class, whether it is in South Africa, whether it's expressed by control of mines or whatever exactly it is, because the consistent point is, well, why is the West there? Why does the West want it? Well, it's because of the resources. So therefore, Africa, the line, that's absolutely true. Africa is not poor. There is the most incredible wealth in Africa, but theoretically, if all Western elements left tomorrow, what would happen? Would that massive wealth be realized and spread across the population? No, I mean it absolutely wouldn't. Would it in time? Would there be sufficient pressure from groups within societies that could sort of organize and coalesce? Well, I don't know. That's just a sort of thought experiment. We can't know, because it is extremely unlikely to happen. So
it's a complex system. That's what you're saying. It's highly complex.
Absolutely. It is complicated. But just to go back to sorry, because I don't think I quite finished the point, but the defense diplomacy thing, what I think is very interesting is that putting all the eggs in one basket and in effect saying Russia is the big threat, which is why our defense diplomacy has to be centered on Ukraine. They pay lip service to, they talk about the other regions. I wrote some of the things down because I just thought, wow, they in the Middle East. So the defense diplomacy strategy says that the influence in the Middle East will be maintained by our persistent military footprint. I just thought you used the word persistent was interesting, because it sort of suggests that the hosts are not necessarily entirely happy about it. And then in Africa, it's to do with the promotion of peace and stability. Now, this is why I think it is fascinating, because that is basically an outright lie. That is obviously those are the activities that are being conducted, and the team that I worked for, which, as I understand it, is actually in jeopardy. So very interesting that you would put out a defence diplomacy strategy and you would boast about having contact, having a sort of unique contact in Africa through a team that is now only run out of Nairobi. There used to be a sister team down in Johannesburg, but that shut up shop some time ago. So you apparently have this capability, this ability to influence through what are described as peace and stability operations, training programs, and all the rest of it. And then at the same time, you think you might wind it up. But actually, is it really peace and stability that's being promoted? And I think the two obvious examples to cast doubt on that are Sudan and Somalia. And they are completely related, because here we are in a situation where supposedly the United Kingdom is protecting her interests and her allies across the Middle East. Now, one of those is the United Arab Emirates, and the United Arab Emirates is without doubt enabling and perpetuating conflict in Sudan via the sales of arms to the RSF, but also through the procurement of gold from Sudan. And yet we're supporting UAE at the same time as apparently promoting peace and stability in Africa. Well, that's quite clearly an absolute nonsense, but also at the same time we're protecting UAE from the supposed threat from Iran. And so there's a sort of extraordinary cycle of dishonesty and deception and conflict and death there. And then the other obvious one is the amazing inconsistency and sort of muddying of the waters on Somalia and Somaliland. Now, in 1960, Somaliland, which had been, in effect, an independent, well, very briefly at independence, before it joined the country of Somalia, it was British and has campaigned for, and since 1991 declared itself as sovereign, which has been a very, very uneasy relationship between Somalia and Somaliland, which forms the sort of northwest of the country. Now, in 2024, Ethiopia signed a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland in which they said that they were going to recognise the sovereignty of Somaliland as being distinct from Somalia, and that through investment into the port of Berbera on the Somaliland coast, which is owned by DP World, which is a United Arab Emirates company, that Ethiopia was going to have facilitated through this Berbera corridor access to a port through which they could trade and project naval power. Now, that sounds like something that Somalia would have an issue with, because first of all, it's recognising sovereignty of Somaliland as distinct from Somalia, which is clearly a problem, but also it's changing the balance of power in the region by giving Ethiopia, a neighbour with which they've had fractious relationships, the ability to trade and, as I say, project naval power. Now, who funded or who's provided quite a lot of the funding for this? The British. So there's been British investment in what's called this Berbera trade corridor, and indeed into the port of Berbera. And yet, at the very same time, there is obviously a British embassy in Mogadishu, in Somalia. So we are absolutely continuing to play both sides, and at the same time, sort of pretending that we are there acting in the interests of peace and stability. That is quite patently not the case. So I think one has to look at all these things with an enormous quantity of salt and really consider why any of this is happening, and indeed, what the consequences of any of this are. It's the whole thing in a way is something of a smokescreen, but it's a very, very confused picture. And actually, even within government, even within the British government, I have to say, one does wonder, and I know this will create questions and perhaps make me seem naive, because it's slightly going down the, well, is it cock up or conspiracy line? But actually, I must say, having dealt with the various government departments that fund these projects, I can say absolutely for sure that they are not talking to departments that are funding similar projects literally a couple of 100 miles down the road. So there is, within the British government, certainly a massive element of confusion as to exactly what is going on. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. Doesn't mean to say that there isn't conspiracy running alongside this, and that there isn't deliberate attempt to create division or whatever. But I can say for sure that the people who are managing the money and actually making these projects happen are doing so in isolation. They don't understand what is going on, probably just down the corridor where somebody else is running a concurrent project with probably an opposing intent with regard to outcome. It's extraordinary.
I was going to say, this is the unfortunate problem with the space that we find ourselves in, is that we always have to add a disclaimer when we say something like that. It is a little bit annoying. It is entirely plausible that you have a combination of design and emergence in these things. It's completely normal for cock-ups to happen, and it's also completely normal for deliberate nefarious activity to happen. Both can exist.
They can, and in fact, just to articulate that, I do remember being visited because let's call it sort of military tourism. In fact, again, reading from this strategy document, what do they say? That the United Kingdom has a deployed capability in 97 countries in the world. Last year, I think it was, there were 400 non-operational activities conducted through all these countries, and we have a defence section. So every British sort of consular outpost or diplomatic outpost will have a defence section. Well, sorry, maybe not every one, but we have a defence section in 172 countries in the world. So the footprint or the tentacles, whatever you want to say, are many, and they spread very, very wide. And therefore, it means that when you are in some way responsible for any of this, and you're high up the pecking order, it means you've got carte blanche. You can go, I want to go and visit, I want to go to Kathmandu. I've sort of, and so you create some flimsy pretext for going to see what the team are up to, and you basically go off on a jolly, and that's all great. But what is interesting about that is to find out how whimsical any of this stuff can be. I remember being visited in Nairobi by he was then one of the, he must be an assistant. He was either vice chief of the defence staff or assistant chief of defence staff. I forget which, but he had sort of overall responsibility, at least on the defence side, for what we were doing. And he was, among his entourage was a girl who worked for what was called Defence Intelligence Services. Now, she was civilian, civil servant, but the pairing of them, and I can remember being in a meeting with them, it just made you think, wow, this is a recipe for absolute disaster. So she was regarded as a bright spark and was therefore on a civil service fast track thing, which meant that she'd spent 2 years on Africa, and then she might be in the Ministry of Transport next. So all of her input, which was considerable, and the way in which she could shape the decision-making process of her boss was based on her academic prowess rather than any background or any knowledge in what should have been the sort of specialist subject area. And so it made you think, wow, this is quite incredible. This chap could get on a flight back and think, well, I've seen this and I've been told that I think from next month we'll do something completely different. And he could just do that. Now, the consequence then for a hosting African nation could be really quite considerable. So this idea that there is one gigantic conspiracy is not, well, at least in the realm of things I'm talking about, is not really credible. Okay, you could say, well, what influence did a small team in Nairobi really exert? Well, I would say quite a lot. And again, as an intelligence conduit back to London, quite considerable. We were there on the ground. We got to see and do the things that, well, we've talked about this before, but, for example, AFRICOM, Africa Command from the United States, based in Germany, they did not have eyes and ears on the ground in the same way. So there was absolutely a purpose to it and a value extracted from it. But as I say, the way in which things actually transpired were very often confusing and totally contradictory, because there can be these extraordinary sort of personality-based interventions.
This is all sort of macro analysis. On a personal level, Charles, what did you take home with you?
Well, the personal level. I mean, as I said at the start, being.
Would you go
drawn,
back? Let's start there. Would you go back?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, okay, different circumstances and whatnot. I think the way I would look at it is, would I do it again? If I'd got to that same fork in the road, is that the path I'd have chosen? And absolutely 100 times out of 100, yes, without doubt. I mean, it was completely fascinating and compelling and charming, and yes, I mean, it was actually it was properly challenging as well. And I think the other bit that I haven't mentioned is that the British Army, for good or ill, unfortunately quite often ill, retains access to large training areas up in the north of the country, and that we had a relationship with that unit as well, and we were able to put African troops through those sorts of training serials and whatnot. But no. So from a job point of view, yeah. I mean, first of all, one thing that I really shouldn't omit is the detail that my route, because traffic in Nairobi was absolutely terrible, my route to work was a 45-minute trip that took me through Nairobi National Park. Now, Nairobi's a really odd place because it has a really fairly substantial park with everything, lion, leopard, the works in it. And my route to work took me through the park gate and out the other side. And so that was pretty incredible to go from having been in a sort of stuffy headquarters in London to being able to effectively have a game drive on the way to work every morning. But no, I think working alongside Africans in all capacities, because obviously I was surrounded mostly by military types, but we had plenty of civilian staff as well, and just functioning as part of that society. And I alluded to this before in a banter session, but I was very grateful that the way in which we did it was, whilst we wore uniform and drove in marked vehicles, we were absolutely part of the community, and that really was terrific. And there is, you describe this a lot. There is a freedom, and I would say, notwithstanding the differences between, say, South Africa and Kenya, there is absolutely a freedom in being in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. In some ways, bureaucratic obstacles can be enormous because of the sort of Byzantine processes, but actually, mostly getting stuff done is so much easier than one would be used to in a Western, so-called developed Western country.
That's a strange anecdote.
I'm a bit out of date, but then everything was kept on paper, so it was all done on files and files and files, and sort of technically could take considerable periods of time, but actually it sort of tended not to. And again, everything you could say this is corrupt. Yeah, okay, corrupt probably is perhaps
Definitely
the right word for it. But just getting stuff done, just getting things processed, and having people just dig in and graft for you, and realize that. And I think this is so regrettable. This is where we've lost the ability in the West to treat each other like human beings. For one reason or another, it is not uncommon to end up in a bit of a bind where you've just got to get something done really quickly because for whatever reason, something just has put you under pressure, and you want to be able to speak to somebody on the telephone and say, look, this has happened. I just really need it done by the end of today. And you'll get the, well, we'll aim to respond within 5 working days, or, no one cares. Whereas I think in Africa, there is absolutely a recognition of that and treating people on a human level. And people really do, I think, even in a big city environment, I think people do absolutely look out for each other, and that was terrific. And again, I think, for anyone who hasn't been, okay, I have talked a little bit about sort of being a white face in a sea of black faces, but I must say, it really does not make any difference. It doesn't matter what colour you are. Of course, the other thing about East Africa, Uganda less so clearly because of what Idi Amin did, but there is significant Asian population as well, sort of Indian population. So yes, okay, there are, that you'll hear people talk about the way in which supposedly those groupings regard one another, and yes, of course, there can be sources of conflict, but by and large, day-to-day activity, yeah, it's a total joy. And yeah, I mean, not without humor. I mean, there is always funny stuff happening. That is absolutely without a doubt. And I don't mean that, I don't mean that in sort of in an unkind way, sort of laughing at, but just the way in which things are done. I think, as an example, I found it so frustrating to watch. But just I worked in this headquarters. We built a headquarters in an area where water was very scarce, and yet every day the guys who worked for the general commanding the place would wash his car using the fire hoses. So if the building catches fire, you were meant to put the building out with the fire hoses, but they were used for washing cars. I said, look, I don't think that's a very good idea, because if the building catches fire, we're kind of done for. I mean, really, what was the likelihood of the building catching fire? Yeah, pretty low. And it was just, it was sort of a check on myself, because in fact, the other concern really was, well, the water's going to run out. And sure enough, it did. And I thought, gosh, how silly, why not just conserve the water? And then I think, no, well, but why? What for? The only change, apart from the fact that maybe the building would burn down, is that you just don't wash the cars. And that doesn't really matter. And I can't say that this can be the case for, all of Africa. All Africans think like this, but actually the way in which resources, I think in particular, are regarded is very different, and I think it does enable people. Certainly, a lot of the Africans I worked with and got to know, it enables a great sort of a more fatalistic, positive, sort of happy-go-lucky approach to life. Because if you've got it, you've got it. You use it. If you haven't got it, well, you haven't got it. And that was, yeah, I think so. And it was really interesting, because I think, it was I mean, I know it sounds like a really trivial example, but I think it does actually speak volumes about the difference in mindset that in the West we are sort of conditioned to have. It's all about the future and this, that, and the other. We never ever concentrate on the present. And okay, washing a car might seem like a silly example of that, but it's not. I don't think it is a silly example. I think it does strike to the heart of the differences in which we do regard stuff, and that, of course, does speak back to this idea of the British government having a defence diplomacy strategy and imagining that the way in which they write that is going to be understood by the people who are sort of subject to that strategy. It's a mismatch.
Yeah. Now I'm going to give you an anecdote that is going to unfortunately counter your good experiences with time efficiency.
Yeah.
But that might be a difference between sort of the southern parts of Africa and the sort of northern central parts where you were. But just, I mean, as we're coming in for landing, let me tell you this story. So my wife and I, a few years ago, we went to a friend's wedding in the south of Zimbabwe. So they were on a farm. But just over the border, instead of flying there, which is actually quite complicated because you have to fly to Harare and then you got to drive all the way down, we decided to fly to Johannesburg and then take a car from Johannesburg and drive up over the border. Well, this became an experience on its own. Just to get over the border took us around 4.5 hours. On the Zimbabwean side, we had to go through a whole series of customs and immigration, whatever else. And they had in the one area, they had all these cubicles with glass and computers. But Not one of the computers was plugged in. They were all just standing there. Everything was still done on paper. So you were saying earlier that stuff is done on paper. And I found this the funniest thing. Everything, they had all these computers, but there were no cables. We got through eventually.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, that's it. There are absolutely countless examples of it. It's, very similar thing. I actually remember coming in through a border crossing with the vehicle document, the carnet de passage, and the guy at the border had absolutely no idea. He'd never seen one before. He had no idea what you're supposed to do with it. And of course, it's that is really, really tricky ground. That is always a very, very sticky one, potential sort of diplomatic incident, because of course you have to walk the line between being seen to be not telling the person what to do at the same time as helping them do it, and making sure that you don't get that wrong, because the moment you tell them, you basically give them the impression that they don't know what they're talking about and they're getting it wrong. You are in a world of trouble. So yes, going back to the sort of the theme of defense diplomacy, maybe not defense, but diplomacy was always part of it. But no, the computer thing, I mean, that is a great anecdote, and that one of the guys I worked with, it was kind of humorous, but there was absolutely more than a grain of truth to it. He always described the people we work with as never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and it was very frequently the case. So I do go back to the point that it is way oversimplistic to just blame the West or indeed foreign influences for the plight of the everyday African. But then again,
there's also just a lot of incompetence. How far back
there is. There's a huge amount of incompetence. But then actually, to be fair, if I look at the amount of incompetence in the United Kingdom at the moment, which is absolutely considerable, and then I trace that back to where I think that's come from, which is the sort of combination of indoctrination via education and a kind of nanny state, removal of risk, and all the various things, as well as, unfortunately, computers that are plugged in, and therefore people's brains get unplugged. So these things are all related, and I think that that Africa has obviously now suffered. I say suffered. I mean, has been on the receiving end of generations or decades of, in a way, similar projects. The education, particularly of Africans, in the way that we would regard education, is clearly, that's a disaster, and that will absolutely engender the types of things that we're talking about. So yes, to stop the influence of other countries would, I'm sure, in time yield a great dividend, but the bit in between would be incredibly uncomfortable.
Now, at this point of the conversation, I normally ask my guest, where can I follow your work? But I think that's quite obvious, ukcolumn.org.
Yeah, absolutely. And for more like this, but also plenty of other stuff. And we should, well, in fact, we are going to be meeting later today because we just put out our very first issue of The Column, our fantastic new quarterly, which you've designed the front cover of. And issue 2 is now well, it's in progress, and we are in the sort of early stages of designing that. So yes, do go to UK Column. We've got lots on. There's a heck of a lot of stuff going on there, and a lot for people to think about, and a lot to consider in terms of what it is we are aiming to achieve, and also what it is that we are saying, because we talk about an awful lot of things, but talking about them is just not necessarily to endorse them. And I think that's just a point it seems to be a point that needs to be made, because a lot of people don't really understand the difference between discussion and endorsement.
On that note, Charles Malet, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Just by the way, before I end the recording, if you were French, it would be Charles Malet.
Yeah, it would, yeah. Yeah, and then there'd be at least 14 countries in Africa where I presumably would be regarded as French. Yeah, quite right.
All right. Thanks, Charles.
Thanks.